What would you do if you found true love at your own wedding with someone who wasn't your bride? Have you ever felt completely alone in a room full of people? Have you ever gone through the motions of what you thought you should do, even when your heart was screaming, "This is wrong"? Maybe you sat through events where everyone around you was celebrating, but you felt like you were drowning in expectations that had nothing to do with your actual happiness? Well, today I'm sharing the most incredible story you've ever heard. One that will completely change how you think about love, success, and what it means to find your true partner in life. This is the story of Dorian Blackwell, a billionaire CEO who discovered that sometimes the most life-changing moments happen when you least expect them. But here's the question that will blow your mind. What happens when two rival CEOs meet at the worst possible moment and change each other's lives forever? If you've ever felt trapped by other people's expectations, hit that like button right now, because this story will show you what's possible when you choose authenticity over appearances. And trust me, you're going to need to hear every single word. Let me take you to Chicago's most exclusive wedding of the year, the kind of event that makes headlines before it even happens. We're talking about crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, guest lists that read like a who's who of American power, and enough political connections to influence entire elections. At the center of this extravagant celebration was Dorian Blackwell, a man whose steel-gray eyes had stared down boardrooms full of competitors, whose ruthless business acumen had built Blackwell Enterprises into a tech empire worth billions, and whose very presence could make or break deals worth more money than some countries' entire budgets. This wasn't just any wedding. This was a union everyone had been waiting for, the perfect merger of power and politics. Dorian's bride, Corinne Langston, was the daughter of one of America's most influential politicians, a woman who looked flawless in photographs and could charm donors at million-dollar fundraisers. On paper, it was the match of the century. In reality, it was about to become the loneliest night of Dorian's life. While hundreds of guests in designer gowns and custom tuxedos floated to the grand ballroom, making deals over champagne and gossiping about stock portfolios, the groom sat quietly at a corner table, watching his own celebration unfold around him like he was an outsider looking in. The irony was devastating. Here was a man who commanded respect in boardrooms across the world, who could influence markets with a single decision, who had more wealth and power than most people could comprehend. And yet, at his own wedding, he might as well have been invisible. Corinne was busy working the room with her political family, posing for photographs that would appear in tomorrow's society pages, discussing campaign strategies with senators and governors who saw this wedding as just another networking opportunity. The dance floor was packed, but nobody approached Dorian. The conversations flowed around him, but nobody included him. The laughter filled the air, but none of it was directed at anything he said. That's when the whispers started. Look at the CEO, all alone at his own party. Who would want to dance with him when the bride's family is so much more interesting? I guess money can't buy you everything. Every word was like a knife, cutting through the facade of success to reveal the truth Dorian had been trying to ignore for months. He had agreed to this marriage not for love, but for business alliances. He had never truly connected with Corinne, never felt that spark that everyone talks about, never experienced the kind of partnership that makes you feel less alone in the world. But what happened next would change everything he thought he knew about love, connection, and what it really means to find someone who sees you for who you truly are. As Dorian sat there, nursing his third glass of champagne and trying to look like he was enjoying himself, the reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. This was supposed to be the moment when everything clicked into place, when all the business deals, all the strategic partnerships, all the careful networking finally paid off in personal happiness. Instead, he felt like he was watching someone else's life play out in front of him. The ballroom was a masterpiece of excess. Silk drapes and ivory and gold cascaded from 30-foot ceilings. Flower arrangements that cost more than most people's cars adorned every table. A live orchestra played classical pieces that nobody was actually listening to because they were too busy making connections and closing deals. But all of this luxury, all of this carefully orchestrated perfection, couldn't hide the fact that Dorian felt more isolated than he ever had in his entire life. Corinne swept past his table for the fourth time in an hour, her wedding dress trailing behind her like she was floating on air. She paused just long enough to place a perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder and whisper, "Darling, Senator Morrison wants to discuss that infrastructure bill with you later. Make sure you're available. Not how are you feeling. Not are you enjoying our wedding. Not even I love you. Just another business transaction, disguised as marital conversation. He watched her glide away toward a group of political wives who were discussing campaign fundraising strategies over their salmon courses. She fit in seamlessly, laughing at the right moments, nodding at the appropriate times. Play her role as the perfect political daughter-in-law. The problem was, Dorian had never wanted a political daughter-in-law. He'd wanted a partner. Someone who would choose to sit with him not because it was strategically advantageous, but because they actually enjoyed his company. The dance floor was calling to couples throughout the ballroom. But every time Dorian stood up to approach anyone, they seemed to suddenly find urgent conversations elsewhere. It wasn't that they were being deliberately rude. It was something worse. They were treating him like a business obligation, rather than a human being celebrating his own wedding. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwell," came a voice behind him. He turned to find James Hartford, a tech journalist who'd been following his career for years. "I was wondering if I could get a quick quote about the merger implications of this union. Our readers are very interested in how personal relationships affect business decisions. Even the media saw his wedding as a corporate story." "Not tonight, James," Dorian replied, his voice more tired than angry. "This is supposed to be a celebration." James looked confused, as if the idea of a wedding being about anything other than business implications had never occurred to him. As the journalist walked away, Dorian realized that somewhere along the way, he'd become so focused on building his empire that he'd forgotten to build a life. Every relationship had become transactional. Every conversation had an agenda. Every social interaction was evaluated based on its potential return on investment. No wonder he felt empty. He looked around the ballroom again, this time with fresh eyes. These weren't his friends celebrating with him. They were his business associates networking with each other. The laughter wasn't joyful. It was calculated. The conversations weren't meaningful. They were strategic. Even worse was the growing realization that he'd agreed to marry Corinne for all the wrong reasons. She was beautiful, accomplished, and well-connected. On paper, she was perfect, but they'd never had a single conversation that went deeper than discussing which political events they needed to attend or which business leaders they should invite to dinner. He couldn't remember the last time she'd asked him about his dreams, his fears, his hopes for the future. He couldn't remember the last time he'd asked her either. Their relationship had been built on mutual benefit rather than mutual affection. They were compatible in terms of social status and career advancement, but they'd never been compatible as human beings who actually enjoyed spending time together. The cruel whispers from nearby tables were getting louder and more pointed. Look at him sitting there all alone. You'd think the groom would be having more fun at his own wedding. Maybe he's realizing what a mistake this is. Each comment hit like a physical blow, not because they were wrong, but because they were absolutely right. Dorian Blackwell, who could command the attention of entire conference rooms, who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, who could make decisions that affected thousands of employees. The same man couldn't even enjoy his own wedding reception. The irony was suffocating. He had everything society told him he should want. Wealth, power, influence, and now the perfect marriage to seal his position in Chicago's elite circles. So, why did he feel like he was dying inside? The music swelled. Couples moved gracefully across the dance floor, and conversations buzzed with excitement all around him. But Dorian sat frozen in his corner, wondering if this was what the rest of his life would look like. Endless events where he played a role rather than lived authentically. That's when everything changed. That's when a voice behind him, soft but confident, spoke the words that would transform not just his evening, but his entire understanding of what connection could feel like. "Pretend you're with me." The words came from directly behind him, spoken so softly that for a moment Dorian thought he might have imagined them. But when he turned around, he found himself looking into the most understanding eyes he'd ever seen. A woman stood there, elegant in a deep emerald gown that seemed to catch the light from the chandeliers and reflect it back with quiet confidence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that somehow managed to be more striking than all the elaborate updos in the room. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped him cold. It was the way she was looking at him, not like a business opportunity, not like a networking contact, not like a CEO whose favor might be worth cultivating. She was looking at him like a human being who needed help. "I'm sorry," Dorian managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You look like you're about to disappear into that chair," she said with a gentle smile that reached her eyes. "And judging by the vultures circling this table, you could use a friend right about now." She extended her hand with the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught in finishing schools or corporate training seminars. "Dance with me? Give them something else to talk about." Dorian stared at her outstretched hand like it was the most foreign object he'd ever encountered. When was the last time someone had offered him something without expecting anything in return? When was the last time someone had approached him simply because they wanted to help? "You don't know me," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he was already reaching for her hand. "No," she agreed, her fingers warm and steady as they touched his. "But I know what it's like to feel invisible in a room full of people who should care about you." The moment she pulled him to his feet, Dorian felt something shift. The conversations around them didn't stop, but they changed. Instead of pitying whispers about the lonely groom, there were curious murmurs about the mysterious woman in emerald who had appeared from nowhere. As they walked toward the dance floor, she leaned closer and said, "Just follow my lead. We're going to give you the night you should have had." Have you ever had a stranger show you more kindness than people who claim to love you? Drop a comment and let us know, because what happened next will restore your faith in human connection. The orchestra was playing a waltz, and as they took their positions among the other couples, Dorian realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd actually danced. Not the obligatory first dance that had been choreographed by a wedding planner, not the political photo op slow dance with Corinne that would appear in tomorrow's newspapers. Real dancing, for the simple joy of moving to music with another person. "What's your name?" he asked as they began to move together. "Ivy," she said simply. "Ivy North." "Well, Ivy North, I have to ask, why are you doing this?" She considered the question as they turned, her movements fluid and confident, "Because everyone deserves to feel seen on what's supposed to be one of the most important days of their life." And because, she added with a smile that was both playful and profound, "I've been in your shoes." "You've been married before?" "No," she laughed, and the sound was so genuine that several nearby couples actually turned to look. "But I've been trapped in situations where I was surrounded by people who only saw what they wanted to see, not who I actually was." As they danced, Ivy began to share pieces of her story. She spoke about escaping what she called gilded cages, situations that looked perfect from the outside but felt suffocating from within. She talked about choosing authenticity over appearance, even when it meant disappointing people who had their own agendas for your life. "The hardest part," she said as they moved through a particularly complex turn, "is realizing that the life everyone expects you to want isn't the life that will actually make you happy." Dorian felt something unlock in his chest. Here was someone who understood. Here was someone who had looked at the pressure, the expectations, the carefully constructed facade of success, and had chosen something different. "What did you do?" he asked. "How did you break free?" "I stopped performing," she said simply. "I stopped trying to be the person everyone else needed me to be and started figuring out who I actually was underneath all those expectations." For the first time in months, maybe years, Dorian felt truly present in his own life. The conversations around them faded into background noise. The political maneuvering and business networking became irrelevant. Even Corinne, holding court with a group of senators across the room, seemed like a character in someone else's story. "You know what's funny?" Ivy said as the song began to wind down. "Everyone's staring at us now, but not in the way they were before. They're not pitying you anymore. They're curious about you." Dorian glanced around and realized she was right. The whispers had changed from cruel mockery to genuine interest. People were wondering who this mysterious woman was and why she had chosen to rescue the lonely groom from his corner table. "I don't know how to thank you," Dorian said as the music stopped. "Don't thank me yet." Ivy replied with a smile that held secrets he suddenly desperately wanted to understand. "The night is just getting started." But what Dorian didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom could have guessed, was that the woman who had just saved him from the loneliest night of his life was about to turn his entire world upside down in ways he never could have imagined. Section 4. The Investigation and Discovery. For the next 3 days, Dorian couldn't stop thinking about Ivy North. He tried to focus on a mountain of congratulatory emails flooding his inbox, the business meetings that had been scheduled around his honeymoon, and the political events Corinne had already committed them to attending. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those understanding eyes and heard that genuine laugh that had cut through the artificial noise of his wedding reception. The woman had vanished as mysteriously as she'd appeared. After their dance, she'd stayed for another hour, charming every person she met with an intelligence and warmth that seemed effortless. She'd asked thoughtful questions, remembered names, and somehow made everyone feel like the most interesting person in the room. But when Dorian had looked for her to say goodbye, she was gone. No dramatic exit, no farewell speech, just absent, like she'd never been there at all, except she had been there. And she'd changed something fundamental about how Dorian saw himself in his life. Who was that woman you were dancing with? Corinne had asked her in their drive home, her tone more curious than jealous. I've never seen her at any of the political functions. I don't know, Dorian had admitted. Someone named Ivy North. She said she was an entrepreneur. Ivy North, Corinne had repeated slowly. That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. Probably just someone trying to network their way into our circle. But something about that assessment felt wrong to Dorian. Ivy hadn't behaved like someone trying to climb social ladders or make business connections. She'd acted like someone who already knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. By Tuesday morning, curiosity had turned into obsession. Dorian found himself typing Ivy North Entrepreneur into search engines during board meetings. He asked his assistant to run background checks. He even called the wedding planner to see if she had any record of how Ivy had ended up on the guest list. The results were confusing. There were dozens of Ivy Norths in Chicago, but none of them seemed to match the woman he'd met. A dental hygienist in Naperville, a retired teacher in Oak Park, a college student at Northwestern. None of them were entrepreneurs, and definitely none of them moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. It was his head of security, Marcus Rivera, who finally cracked the mystery. "Boss," Marcus said, walking into Dorian's office on Wednesday afternoon with a folder thick enough to be a novel. "You're not going to believe what I found." Dorian looked up from the quarterly reports he'd been pretending to read. "Please tell me you found something. This is driving me crazy." Marcus dropped into the chair across from Dorian's desk with a satisfied expression of someone who just solved an impossible puzzle. Ivy North isn't just an entrepreneur. She's a CEO and founder of North Energy Solutions. The name hit Dorian like a physical blow. North Energy Solutions was one of the fastest-growing companies in sustainable technology. They were developing revolutionary battery systems, solar innovations, and energy storage solutions that were quietly disrupting entire industries. More importantly, they were Blackwell Enterprises' biggest competitor in the clean tech space. "That's impossible," Dorian said, though even as the words left his mouth, pieces were starting to click into place. The confidence, the intelligence, the way she'd navigated conversations with senators and business leaders, like she was used to holding her own in rooms full of powerful people. "It gets better," Marcus continued, flipping open the folder. North Energy Solutions has been valued at just over $2 billion as of their last funding round. She's been featured on the cover of Forbes, Fortune, and Fast Company, but she almost never does public appearances or media interviews. Marcus slid a magazine across the desk. There, on the cover of Forbes' Most Innovative CEOs Under 40 issue, was Ivy. The same intelligent eyes, the same confident smile, but dressed in a sharp business suit instead of an emerald gown. The headline read, "The Invisible Billionaire, How Ivy North Built an Empire While Staying Out of Spotlight." Dorian stared at the magazine, his mind racing. The woman who had rescued him from the loneliest night of his life wasn't just any entrepreneur. She was one of the most successful business leaders in the country, and arguably his biggest professional rival. "There's more," Marcus said, clearly enjoying the dramatic revelation. "Remember that sustainable energy contract that Blackwell Enterprises lost to an unknown competitor 6 months ago? The one worth $300 million. Dorian nodded slowly, remembering his frustration at losing such a significant deal to a company he'd never heard of. That was North Energy Solutions. Ivy North didn't just dance with you at your wedding. She'd been quietly outmaneuvering you in the marketplace for over a year. What would you do if you discovered your savior was actually your biggest rival? Someone who could have used your vulnerable moment against you but chose kindness instead? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because his revelation changed everything Dorian thought he knew about competition and character. The silence in Dorian's office stretched for what felt like hours. He kept staring at Ivy's photo on the magazine cover. Try to reconcile the woman who had shown him such compassionate understanding with the business rival who had been systematically outperforming his company. She knew, he said finally. She knew exactly who I was when she approached me. Gets better, Marcus said with a grin. According to my sources, she wasn't even supposed to be at your wedding. Her assistant had RSVP'd on behalf of North Energy Solutions, but Ivy never attends social functions. The fact that she showed up personally and then sought you out, Marcus shrugged. That wasn't business. That was personal. Dorian felt something shift in his chest. Ivy hadn't rescued him despite knowing he was her competition. She'd rescued him because of it. She'd seen a fellow entrepreneur drowning in expectations and obligations, and she'd chosen compassion over strategy. In a world where business rivals spent their time looking for weaknesses to exploit, she'd seen his vulnerability and decided to protect it. Marcus, Dorian said slowly, I need everything you can find about North Energy Solutions' current projects, their company culture, and... He paused, feeling like he was about to cross a line he could never uncross. I need to know how to contact Ivy North directly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Boss, are you sure that's wise? She's not just competition. She's winning. That's exactly why I need to talk to her, Dorian replied, though he wasn't entirely sure he could explain what he meant by that. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he'd met someone who had challenged everything he thought he knew about success competition and what it meant to find a genuine connection in a world built on artificial relationships. And he was determined to understand how she'd built an empire while somehow managing to hold on to her humanity. Getting a meeting with Ivy North proved to be harder than negotiating most billion-dollar deals. Her assistant, a politely professional woman named Rebecca, informed Dorian that Ms. North's calendar was fully booked for the next 3 months. When he mentioned that this was regarding their mutual interest in sustainable technology, Rebecca's tone became even more diplomatically distant. Ms. North appreciates Blackwell Enterprises' interest in collaboration, but she's currently focused on internal projects. Perhaps you could submit a formal proposal through our business development team. Dorian hung up feeling frustrated and oddly rejected. This was not how conversations usually went for him. CEOs took his calls. Meetings got rearranged to accommodate his schedule. Assistants certainly didn't brush him off with corporate speak. But then again, Ivy North wasn't like any CEO he'd ever encountered. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He showed up unannounced. North Energy Solutions occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Chicago tower, but the lobby felt completely different from Blackwell Enterprises' intimidating marble and steel aesthetic. This space was warm, inviting, with living walls of plants and comfortable seating areas, where employees were actually sitting and talking rather than rushing past in corporate terror. Mr. Blackwell, came a familiar voice from behind him. I was wondering when you figure out where to find me. He turned to see Ivy walking toward him, dressed in dark jeans and a simple blue sweater that somehow managed to look more professional than most people's expensive suits. She moved with that same confident ease he remembered from the wedding, but now he understood why. This was her domain, her company, her rules. Your assistant is very good at her job, Dorian said. Rebecca is excellent at protecting my time from people who want to waste it. Ivy agreed with a smile. The question is, are you here to waste my time, or do you actually have something interesting to say? Instead of being offended by her directness, Dorian found himself genuinely impressed. When was the last time someone had challenged him so openly? I want to understand how you do it, he said honestly. Do what? Run a company that's successful while somehow managing to remain human. Ivy's expression softened slightly. Walk with me, she said, leading him toward a conference room with glass walls that overlooked the Chicago River. "And explain what you mean by that." As they settled into chairs that were comfortable rather than imposing, Dorian found himself sharing things he'd never said out loud. He talked about feeling like he'd built a successful company by systematically removing every trace of genuine connection from his life. He described the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw him as a business opportunity. "At my own wedding," he said, still unable to believe he was admitting this, "I felt more alone than I've ever felt in my life. Until you showed up." "I know," Ivy said simply. I could see it from across the room. "Why did you help me?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the river. "Because I've been where you were." Not exactly the same situation, but that feeling of being trapped inside a life that looks perfect from the outside, but feels empty from within. "How did you avoid it?" "Your employees actually seem to like working here. They're relaxed, engaged. At Blackwell, people are terrified of me." "That's because you confuse fear with respect," Ivy said, but her tone was gentle rather than judgmental. "Fear might get you short-term compliance, but it kills innovation, creativity, and loyalty. People do their best work when they feel valued, not threatened." Over the next 2 hours, Ivy walked Dorian through her company's approach to everything from employee development to customer relationships to competitive strategy. She showed him financial reports that proved kindness and profitability weren't mutually exclusive. North Energy Solutions had better employee retention, higher customer satisfaction scores, and stronger profit margins than most companies their size. "But the real difference," she said as they toured the office spaces, "is that we're building something that matters. Every project we take on has to pass one simple test. Will this make the world better?" "That's idealistic," Dorian said, though he was starting to think it might also be brilliant. "Is it? Look at our revenue growth. Look at our client retention rates. Look at our employee satisfaction surveys. Turns out that when people believe in what they're doing, they'll move mountains to make it succeed." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation evolved from business philosophy to specific collaborative opportunities. Ivy's sustainable energy innovations could revolutionize Blackwell's infrastructure projects. Dorian's distribution networks could help North Energy Solutions reach markets they'd never been able to access. "This could work," Dorian said, reviewing preliminary ideas they'd sketched out. "We could create something neither of our companies could build alone." "Could work," Ivy agreed, "but only if you're willing to change how you think about leadership." "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, leaning back in her chair with that knowing smile he was beginning to recognize, "that if we're going to be partners, you're going to have to learn to lead with empathy instead of intimidation. You're going to have to trust your people instead of controlling them. And you're going to have to start making decisions based on what's right, not just what's profitable." Dorian felt something shift inside him, the same feeling he'd had on the dance floor at his wedding, like someone was offering him a chance to become a better version of himself. "Are you offering to teach me?" he asked. "I'm offering to show you that there's a different way to build success. A way that doesn't require you to sacrifice your humanity for your bottom line." What happened next would transform not just their companies, but their understanding of what partnership, both business and personal, could really look like. 6 months into his collaboration with Ivy, Dorian made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He asked Corinne for a divorce. The conversation took place in their pristine living room, surrounded by wedding gifts they'd never actually used and photographs from political events where they'd played the perfect couple. But perfection, Dorian had learned, was just another word for emptiness. "I can't do this anymore," he said simply, setting down the divorce papers his lawyer had prepared. Corinne looked up from her tablet, where she'd been reviewing talking points for her father's upcoming campaign, and for a moment her carefully composed political facade slipped entirely. "Thank God," she said, and started laughing. It wasn't the reaction Dorian had expected. "You're not angry?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Angry?" Corinne set down her tablet and looked at him like he was the most oblivious person on earth. "Dorian, I've been miserable for months. We both have. We're roommates who happen to share a last name and show up to the same events. That's not a marriage." The relief in her voice was so obvious that Dorian wondered why they both spent so long pretending their relationship was something it wasn't. My father is going to be furious, Corinne continued. But honestly, I'd rather deal with his anger than spend the rest of my life pretending to be happy with someone I barely know. The actual divorce process was surprisingly civilized. No screaming matches, no bitter custody battles over assets, no tabloid drama. Just two people who had finally admitted that looking good on paper wasn't the same as being good together. But the public reaction was something nobody could have predicted. Initially, the media treated it as a typical celebrity divorce story. Billionaire marriage crumbles after 6 months. Political dynasty dreams destroyed. The shortest elite union in Chicago history. The gossip columns had a field day speculating about affairs, hidden scandals, and secret addictions. Society pages that had celebrated their wedding now dissected every detail of their separation, looking for drama that simply didn't exist. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of hiding from the attention, Dorian decided to tell the truth. In an interview with Chicago Business Journal that was supposed to be about Blackwell Enterprises' new sustainability initiatives, he was asked directly about his personal life. The divorce was the best decision both Corinne and I have made in years, he said, surprising the reporter who'd clearly been fishing for bitter comments. We realized we'd gotten married for all the wrong reasons: business connections, political advantages, social expectations. We were trying to force a partnership that was never meant to exist. So there was no infidelity, no scandal. The only scandal, Dorian replied, was that we spent months lying to ourselves and everyone else about being happy when we weren't. The most honest thing we could do was admit our mistake and move on. Have you ever had to choose between what looked right and what felt right? Between meeting expectations and following your authentic path? This is your reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit when something isn't working, because what happened next inspired thousands of people to examine their own lives. The interview went viral in ways nobody anticipated. Instead of scandal and shame, people saw something refreshing. Two adults taking responsibility for their choices without drama or blame. Social media exploded with comments from people sharing their own stories about staying in situations that looked perfect from the outside but felt wrong from within. Young professionals talked about leaving prestigious jobs that made them miserable. Couples admitted to family pressures that had pushed them toward unsuitable relationships. #authentic choices became a trending hashtag as people shared their own experiences with choosing truth over appearances. But the most surprising response came from other business leaders. CEOs began reaching out to Dorian, not about deals or partnerships, but about his approach to authentic leadership. They wanted to understand how someone could make such a publicly vulnerable admission without destroying their professional reputation. People respect honesty more than perfection, Dorian explained during a follow-up interview. I spent years trying to be the person everyone expected me to be, and it nearly destroyed me. The moment I started being authentic about my struggles and my mistakes, I found more genuine connection than I'd ever experienced before. Media outlets began following his partnership with North Energy Solutions, initially looking for romantic scandal, but finding instead a compelling story about two business leaders who were revolutionizing their industries through genuine collaboration and shared values. The narrative shifted from failed marriage to successful personal growth, from corporate scandal to authentic leadership model, from another elite divorce to inspiration for choosing truth over convenience. And at the center of it all was Ivy North, whose influence on Dorian's transformation was becoming impossible to ignore, though nobody yet understood just how deep their connection had become. Section 7. Powerful Conclusion and Life Lessons. 2 years after that life-changing dance at his own wedding, Dorian Blackwell stood in front of a packed auditorium at Northwestern University's business school, preparing to give a keynote speech that would be watched by millions online. But he wasn't alone on that stage. Beside him stood Ivy North, no longer just his business partner, but his closest friend, his greatest challenge, and the person who had fundamentally changed how he understood success, leadership, and what it meant to build a life worth living. Their companies had merged 6 months earlier, creating Blackwell North Enterprises, a sustainable technology giant that was revolutionizing how businesses thought about profit and purpose. But more importantly, they had created a model of authentic partnership that was inspiring leaders across every industry. 3 years ago, Dorian told the audience of future business leaders, "I thought success meant having the most money, the biggest office, and the kind of reputation that made people afraid to disagree with me. I had all of those things, and I was the loneliest, most miserable person you could imagine." He looked at Ivy, who nodded encouragingly. The night I met Ivy, I was sitting alone at my own wedding, surrounded by hundreds of people who saw me as nothing more than a business opportunity. I was trapped in a marriage that looked perfect but felt empty, running a company that was profitable but soulless. And then this woman walked up to me and said 4 words that changed everything. "Pretend you're with me." Not because she wanted something from me, not because she was trying to network her way into my world, but because she saw another human being who needed help. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. What I learned from Ivy, what she taught me through example rather than lectures, is that real success isn't about dominating your competition. It's about lifting everyone around you. It's not about inspiring fear. It's about earning genuine respect. It's not about building walls to protect what you have. It's about opening doors to create opportunity for others. Ivy stepped forward to share her perspective. When I saw Dorian that night, I didn't see a business rival or a networking opportunity. I saw someone who was drowning in expectations and obligations, just like I had been years earlier. I knew what it felt like to be surrounded by people who only saw what they wanted to see instead of who you actually were. The beautiful thing about authentic partnership, whether in business or in life, is that it multiplies everything good while dividing everything difficult. When you find someone who challenges you to be better while accepting who you are right now, magic happens. Together, they had proven that competitors could become collaborators, that business success could coexist with human decency, and that the most powerful partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than mutual benefit. Their story had inspired thousands of entrepreneurs to reconsider how they define success. Business schools were teaching case studies about their leadership model. Other companies were implementing their approaches to employee development and sustainable growth. But perhaps most importantly, they had shown that sometimes the most transformative relationships begin with a single act of unexpected kindness. So here's what I want you to remember. Dorian said as his speech reached its conclusion. Success without authenticity is just expensive loneliness. Power without empathy is just sophisticated bullying. And achievement without connection is just impressive isolation. The next time you see someone who looks successful from the outside but seems lost on the inside, remember that your kindness might be exactly what they need to find their way back to themselves. And remember that the person who saves you might not look like what you expect. They might be your biggest competitor, your most unlikely ally, or a stranger in an emerald dress who appears exactly when you need them most. If this story has changed how you think about success, partnership, or the power of authentic connection, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Earthly Tales for more stories that challenge how we see the world. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose authenticity over appearances, that real partnership multiplies joy while dividing sorrow, and that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin not with romance, but with simple human kindness. Because in a world that often rewards performance over truth, we all need reminders that the greatest success comes from being genuinely, unapologetically, authentically ourselves.